There is something you have noticed about your life. Maybe you noticed it quietly, late at night, when the noise of the day had finally settled and you were left alone with your thoughts. Maybe you noticed it after a conversation ended badly, one that reminded you uncomfortably of a conversation that ended the same way months ago or years ago. Maybe you noticed it when you looked at a relationship and realized, with a strange sinking feeling, that you had been here before. Not in this exact place, with this exact person, but in this feeling, in this dynamic, in this slow unraveling that somehow always follows the same path. You have been here before. That is the thing you keep noticing, even when you try not to. Even when you tell yourself this time is different. Even when you genuinely believe that it is. You have changed jobs, but the tension with your manager feels familiar. You have moved cities, but the loneliness followed you there. You have started fresh, more than once, and yet something from the old life seems to find you in the new one. Not every detail, not every person, but the shape of it, the emotional texture of it, the way it makes you feel. That part stays the same. This is not something you planned. It is not something you wanted, and it is almost certainly not something you are doing on purpose. But it keeps happening. You make a decision you have made before. You react in a way you swore you would not react again. You attract something into your life that you thought you had moved past. And then, somewhere in the middle of it, you catch yourself thinking, why does this keep happening to me? Why do I keep ending up here? Those questions are important, not because they make you feel worse, but because they mean you are paying attention. Something in you is beginning to see the pattern, and that seeing, even when it is uncomfortable, is where everything starts. This audiobook is about patterns, but not in the way you might expect. It is not going to tell you that you are broken. It is not going to suggest that you are weak or self-destructive or somehow cursed with bad luck. It is not going to offer you a list of things to stop doing and a promise that your life will transform if you simply decide to be different. That is not how patterns work, and it is not how people work either. What this audiobook is going to do is take you inside the actual psychology of why patterns repeat, why the mind returns to familiar territory even when that territory causes pain, why the behavior you most want to stop is often the behavior that feels the most natural in the moment, why change, real change, is not about willpower or decision-making alone. It is about something deeper, something that runs beneath the surface of your daily choices, shaping them quietly, consistently, and almost invisibly. Understanding that something is not a small thing, it is, in many ways, the beginning of a different kind of life. Think for a moment about the patterns you recognize in yourself. Not all of them, just the ones that come to mind easily, the ones that have a certain weight to them. Maybe it is a pattern in your relationships. You find yourself with people who need you more than they appreciate you, or you find yourself pulling away just as things get close, or you find yourself arguing about the same things in slightly different ways with slightly different people across years and decades of your life. Maybe it is a pattern in your work. You start with enormous energy and then lose momentum halfway through. You get close to a goal and then something derails you, often something you did not anticipate, but sometimes something you realize, in hindsight, you saw coming. You hold back when you could step forward. You step forward when something in you knows it is not the right time. Maybe it is a pattern in the way you feel, a particular shade of anxiety that arrives without a clear cause, a familiar heaviness that settles in at certain times of year, or at certain milestones, or whenever things start going too well. A recurring sense that you do not quite deserve what you have, or that it will be taken from you soon, or that you are never quite enough. These patterns are not random. They are not bad luck. They are not a reflection of some fundamental flaw in your character. They are the mind doing exactly what it was designed to do. And that is what you are going to understand here. not as an excuse, not as a way of avoiding responsibility for your choices, but as a framework, a real, psychologically grounded way of understanding why you are the way you are and why change is more possible and more specific than you might have believed. You are not here by accident. The fact that you are listening to this, the fact that some part of you wanted to understand, means the awareness is already beginning. The pattern cannot survive full awareness, not forever, not once you have really seen it. That is what this audiobook is about. Let us begin. The human brain is not primarily designed to make you happy. That might sound harsh, but it is one of the most clarifying things you can understand about your own psychology. The brain's primary job, the thing it was shaped over thousands of years to do, is to keep you alive, to conserve energy, to minimize uncertainty, to recognize what is familiar and treat that familiarity as a form of safety. This is not a flaw in your design. For most of human history, familiarity genuinely was safety. A familiar environment meant you knew where the dangers were. A familiar group meant you were protected. A familiar pattern of behavior meant you had survived it before and could survive it again. The mind learned, very early, to trust what it already knew, not because the known was always good, but because it was survivable. That wiring is still running inside you right now. When you encounter something new, a new relationship dynamic, a new way of thinking about yourself, a new emotional territory, your nervous system reads it as uncertain, and uncertain, to the brain, carries a faint signal of threat. Not always a loud alarm, sometimes just a low hum of discomfort. A subtle pullback toward what is known. The word for what the brain prefers is familiar, and familiarity is not the same as good. It is not the same as healthy. It is not the same as what you consciously want. Familiarity simply means, I have been here before. I know what this feels like. I know what happens next, and knowing what happens next, even if what happens next is painful, is deeply, quietly comforting to the nervous system. This is one of the hardest things to accept about yourself, that some part of you is more comfortable in a painful familiar situation than in an uncertain positive one. Not because you are masochistic, not because you do not want better, but because better is unfamiliar. And unfamiliar, to the deeper parts of your mind, still carries that ancient signal unknown, uncertain, potentially dangerous. This is sometimes called the comfort zone, but that phrase is misleading. It suggests the zone is comfortable. It often is not. A more accurate phrase might be the familiar zone. The zone where your nervous system knows what to expect, even if what it expects is hard. You may have a familiar zone that includes anxiety, a familiar zone that includes conflict, a familiar zone that includes loneliness or rejection, or falling just short of where you wanted to be. These are not zones you chose, but over time, they became yours. They became the terrain your nervous system learned to navigate. And the brain, efficient as it is, keeps returning to terrain it already knows. There is a concept in psychology called the repetition compulsion. It was first described by Sigmund Freud, and while much of Freudian theory has been revised over the decades, this particular observation has held up remarkably well in clinical practice and neurological research. The repetition compulsion is the mind's tendency to recreate familiar situations, particularly emotionally charged ones from early life, not to relive the pain, but to try unconsciously to resolve it, to get it right this time, to finally get the outcome that the original situation did not provide. You may not be consciously aware of doing this. Almost no one is. But if you look at the patterns in your life, especially the painful ones, you may begin to see the emotional logic beneath them. The situations you keep recreating often carry a familiar emotional charge, and that charge usually has roots that go further back than you might initially recognize. Beyond the repetition compulsion, there is a more basic neurological mechanism at work. The brain learns through repetition. Every time you do something, every time you think a thought, feel a feeling, engage in a behavior, The neural pathway associated with that experience becomes slightly more established, slightly more efficient, slightly easier to activate next time. This is how skills are built. It is how habits form, and it is also how emotional patterns become automatic. When a particular emotional response, say, shutting down when someone raises their voice, or apologizing immediately when there is conflict, or catastrophizing when something uncertain arises, has been repeated many times over many years, it becomes wired into the nervous system. It no longer feels like a choice. It feels like a reaction. It feels in some deep way like you. But it is not you. It is a pathway that was built through repetition. And pathways that are built through repetition can, with different kinds of repetition, be rebuilt. This is not a simple process. It is not fast. It is not painless. But it is possible, in a way that is grounded in how the brain actually works. Not in wishful thinking, and not in the idea that simply deciding to change is enough. The reason deciding is not enough is precisely because the patterns you most want to change are not primarily living in the part of your brain that makes decisions. They are living in older, deeper structures. Structures that operate faster than conscious thought. Structures that were shaped before you had language, before you had the ability to reason about your experience, before you even understood that your experience was something that could be reasoned about. Understanding this does not make you helpless. It makes you more specific. Instead of fighting yourself with willpower, which is exhausting and rarely works long term, you begin to understand the actual terrain you are working with, the actual architecture of why you do what you do, and that understanding changes everything, not immediately, not magically, but fundamentally. When you stop being confused about why you keep repeating patterns and start understanding it, really understanding it, not as an intellectual concept, but as a lived recognition, the relationship you have with yourself begins to shift. You stop treating your patterns as evidence of your failure. You start treating them as information, as clues, as maps to something that needs to be seen before it can be changed. The mind repeats what is familiar because repetition is how it maintains its model of the world. Change the model, and the behavior begins to change with it. But you cannot change the model by force. You change it by seeing it clearly first, by understanding how it was built, and by giving the nervous system repeated experiences of something different, something new, until that too becomes familiar. That is the long version of how change actually works. And it starts here with this: the patterns in your life are not accidents. They are the logical output of a mind doing its job, a mind that learned, a long time ago, what the world was like, and has been confirming that learning ever since. The question is not why you repeat patterns. You repeat them because the mind is doing exactly what minds do. The question is, what did the mind learn? And is that learning still serving you? Most of what you do in a day, you do not decide to do. This might sound strange, because it does not feel that way from the inside. From the inside, you feel like a person making choices. You feel like someone who wakes up, assesses the day, and decides how to move through it. And in some narrow sense, that is true. There are genuine decisions embedded in your day, but beneath those decisions, and far more frequently than you might realize, your behavior is being run by something else. Something that does not require your conscious attention because it has learned to operate without it. Scientists who study human behavior estimate that somewhere between 40 and 95% of daily behavior is habitual, automatic, running on patterns that were established through previous repetition and are now executed below the threshold of conscious thought. 40 to 95%. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it means for the story you tell about your life. The story in which you are the deliberate author of your choices. The one who decided to be this way, to end up here, to keep doing what you keep doing. That story is true in a limited sense, but it is also, in a very real way, incomplete. Much of what you do is not decided. It is retrieved. Your brain has a filing system for behavior. Every time you do something in a particular context, the brain stores that association. This context, plus this stimulus, equals this response. Over time, with enough repetition, the association becomes so strong that the response fires automatically. You do not have to think about it. You do not have to choose it. It simply happens, and then you are already in the middle of it before the thinking part of your brain has had a chance to weigh in. This system has an obvious advantage. It frees up your conscious attention for genuinely new situations. Instead of having to manually decide how to brush your teeth, how to drive a familiar route, how to respond to a greeting, how to sit down and open a laptop, all of that is handled by automatic processing. You are free to think about something else, but that same system, that same efficiency, is also operating on your emotional responses, on your relationship dynamics, on the way you handle stress, conflict, criticism, intimacy, failure, and success. And in those areas, automatic is not always helpful. Consider the experience of being criticized, not dramatic criticism, just everyday feedback. A comment from a colleague, a gentle correction from a partner, a tone of voice that suggests mild disapproval. For many people, the response to even mild criticism is immediate and physical. The chest tightens. The jaw sets. Something defensive rises up fast, before there is even time to process the actual content of what was said. The response is not to the words. It is to the signal, and the signal was recognized by a part of the brain that operates much faster than language. That response, the tightness, the defensiveness, the urge to explain or withdraw or counter-attack, was not a decision, it was a retrieval. The brain recognized a pattern criticism incoming, deploy the usual response, and it did in milliseconds before the conscious mind had time to do anything about it. This is how most emotional reactions work, not as deliberate responses to the present moment, but as automatic deployments of stored patterns. Now consider where those patterns came from. The automatic response to criticism did not appear out of nowhere. It was built through years of experience in the specific environment you grew up in. If criticism in your early life came paired with withdrawal of affection, or with punishment, or with a particular tone of voice that meant danger, the nervous system learned criticism equals threat, and it filed that association in the automatic system. Which is why, decades later, in an entirely different context with an entirely different person, the same physical response fires. The context has changed. The person has changed. But the pattern has not been updated. The brain is still retrieving a response that was built for a different time. This is one of the most important things to understand about automatic behavior. It is almost always adaptive at the time it was formed. The child who learned to go quiet when there was conflict in the home was not making a mistake. They were learning a survival strategy. They were adapting to the emotional environment around them, doing the only thing they could do, figure out how to get through it. But that strategy, forged in childhood, efficient and automatic, does not know that 30 years have passed. It does not know that the person in front of you now is not the person from your childhood. It fires based on similarity of signal, and it will keep firing until something interrupts it. You have probably noticed this in yourself. You have probably had the experience of responding to something, really responding, in a full physical and emotional way, and then realizing, either in the moment or afterward, that your response was bigger than the situation warranted, that the intensity of what you felt did not quite match the actual circumstances. That mismatch is a clue. It is the signature of an automatic response that is drawing on old material. The present moment triggered a stored pattern, and the stored pattern played out, loudly, clearly, and without waiting for your permission. The same dynamic operates in habits that are less emotionally charged, but perhaps equally consequential. The habit of reaching for your phone when you feel a flicker of boredom or discomfort. The habit of saying yes when you mean no, not because you made a considered decision to agree, but because the automatic system retrieved the usual response before you had time to check in with yourself. The habit of putting off a difficult task, not through deliberate procrastination, but through a chain of small automatic behaviors that fill the time until the window for starting has passed. These are not failures of discipline. They are the outputs of patterns that have been reinforced through repetition until they run on their own. What makes this particularly powerful is that automatic behavior tends to create environments that reinforce the behavior. If you automatically avoid conflict, you may find yourself in relationships where conflict avoidance has become the norm, and where any attempt to speak directly feels disproportionately difficult because the entire relational pattern has been built around the avoidance. The behavior created the environment. The environment now reinforces the behavior. This is what a self-sustaining pattern looks like. It is not just a habit inside you. It is a habit that has shaped the world around you to match itself. Think about the people in your life, the dynamics you have with them, the roles you tend to play. There is likely a quality of familiarity to those dynamics, not because you sat down and chose a particular relational role, but because the automatic system settled into its groove, the environment adapted to it, and over time the groove got deeper. This is not a criticism of the people in your life or of you. It is simply what happens when unconscious patterns interact. Everyone in a relationship, any kind of relationship, is bringing their own automatic system, their own stored responses, forged in their own particular history. And those automatic systems interact. They trigger each other. They create dynamics that feel personal and unique, but are, at a deeper level, patterned. Now here is something important. Recognizing that your behavior is largely automatic does not mean you are not responsible for it. Responsibility and automaticity are not opposites. You can understand that a pattern has been running on autopilot and still take responsibility for the effects of that pattern. In fact, understanding the automaticity is what makes real responsibility possible, because it allows you to intervene before the pattern runs, rather than simply managing the fallout after. Intervention is possible. This is essential to hold on to. The automatic system is powerful, but it is not all-powerful. It runs fastest and most completely when you are on autopilot, when your attention is scattered, when you are tired or stressed or in a highly familiar environment that requires nothing new from you. Under those conditions, the patterns run virtually unimpeded, but the automatic system can be interrupted, not by force and not by shame, by awareness. When you become genuinely aware that a pattern is running, not just intellectually aware, as in, yes, I know I have this tendency, but actually present to it, noticing it in the moment, something shifts. The automatic retrieval slows down. The gap between stimulus and response opens up, even slightly, and in that gap, something else becomes possible. You do not have to fill that gap perfectly. You do not have to have the ideal response ready. The gap itself is the beginning. The awareness itself is the interruption. What feeds automatic behavior most is invisibility. The pattern runs best when you cannot see it, when it feels like just the way things are, or just who you are, or just what always happens. The moment you can see it, really see it, with some degree of detachment, the pattern loses some of its grip. Not all of it immediately, but some of it. And that some is where change begins. You have patterns running right now that you cannot yet see. Responses that feel like personality, habits that feel like character, reactions that feel like facts about the world. Part of what this audiobook is designed to do is help you begin to see them. Not to judge them, not to force them to stop, simply to see them. Because the seen pattern is the beginning of the changed pattern, and the automatic does not have to be permanent. Of all the patterns that repeat in your life, the emotional ones are often the most powerful and the least visible. They are the most powerful because they move fastest. Before you have had time to think, you are already feeling. Before the thinking brain has even registered what is happening, the body has responded, the emotion has arrived, and the familiar pattern is already underway. They are the least visible because they feel like the truth. When you feel anxious, the anxiety feels like an accurate report on the situation. When you feel unlovable, that feeling carries the weight of fact. When you feel that something is about to go wrong, or that you are about to be abandoned, or that you are being criticized unfairly, or that you do not deserve what you have. Those feelings do not announce themselves as patterns. They announce themselves as reality. But emotional patterns are not reality. They are learned responses, and like all learned responses, they can be examined, understood, and, with time and repetition, changed. To understand how emotional patterns form, you need to go back, at least briefly, to where most of them began early life. This is not about blame, it is about architecture. The emotional patterns you carry as an adult were not designed in a vacuum. They were shaped in a specific environment, with specific people, during a period when your nervous system was exquisitely sensitive to its surroundings and had almost no capacity for abstract reasoning. You were, as a child, a learning machine, not just learning facts and language and motor skills. You were learning how the emotional world worked, what feelings were acceptable, and which ones brought disapproval or withdrawal, how to read the mood of the room, what to do with your own needs, what to expect when you were vulnerable, whether the world was, at its emotional core, a safe place or an uncertain one. Those early learnings were not stored as memories you can recall and examine. They were stored in the body, in the nervous system, in the reflexes of the emotional life. This is why your emotional reactions often feel so immediate and physical. The chest tightening when you feel criticized, the sudden shrinking when you are in a group and the attention turns to you, the wave of panic when you receive a message that begins with the words "we need to talk." These physical responses are the body retrieving an old emotional memory, not a remembered event, necessarily, but a remembered state, a familiar emotional territory that the nervous system recognizes and enters automatically. The specific emotional patterns vary widely from person to person because they were shaped by specific environments. But there are some patterns that are common enough to be worth naming because recognizing them in yourself can be the beginning of a significant shift. One of the most common emotional patterns is what might be called anxious anticipation. This is the chronic low-level hum of expecting things to go wrong. It is not dramatic. It is not paralyzing. It is simply present, most of the time, as a kind of background noise, a sense that you are waiting for the other shoe to drop, that the good thing cannot last, that something is always about to go sideways. If this is your pattern, it did not form because the world is objectively dangerous. It formed because, in your particular emotional environment, things did tend to go wrong unexpectedly, or because the people around you modeled anxious anticipation so consistently that your nervous system absorbed it as the default setting. The brain learned uncertainty equals danger, stay vigilant, expect the worst, and it has been doing that ever since. Another common emotional pattern is what might be called approval orientation. A chronic, mostly unconscious scanning for whether you are acceptable, whether you are liked, whether your presence is welcome and your behavior is approved of. A sensitivity to perceived rejection that operates below the level of conscious thought and shapes choices about what to say, what not to say, what to pursue, what to avoid, in ways that are profound and often invisible. This pattern typically forms in environments where love or approval was conditional, where you learned, early and deeply, that being acceptable was not guaranteed. That the way to feel safe was to monitor and manage other people's perceptions of you. That your own needs were secondary to the emotional climate of the room. The adult who carries this pattern may not consciously think "I need approval to feel safe." They simply feel a compulsive discomfort when they sense disapproval, and a disproportionate relief when they receive validation. The behavior that follows, people-pleasing, over-explaining, difficulty saying no, a tendency to minimize their own needs, feels natural because it has been practiced for so long that it is deeply automatic. There is also the emotional pattern of emotional shutdown, a learned ability to disconnect from feeling, to go quiet inside when things get too intense, to become rational and measured and slightly unreachable precisely in the moments when emotion is most present. This is not coldness. It is not indifference. It is a skill that was built in an environment where being fully emotionally present was somehow unsafe, where expressing emotion led to dismissal or to escalation or to loss of control of some kind. The nervous system learned go internal, stay controlled, do not let the feeling out. And it became very good at exactly that. The cost of this pattern, and every pattern has a cost, is that genuine connection requires emotional presence, and emotional presence is precisely what this pattern shuts down. The person who learned to disconnect from feeling may find intimacy elusive, not because they do not want it, but because the emotional muscles required for it were never fully developed, and because vulnerability triggers the old shutdown reflex. These patterns, anxious anticipation, approval orientation, emotional shutdown, and the many variations that exist between and beyond them, are not character flaws. They are adaptive responses to specific emotional environments. They made sense when they were formed. They were, in the truest sense of the word, intelligent. But they follow you into the present, into situations where the original conditions no longer apply, and they shape your experience of those situations in ways that can make it very difficult to see clearly. One of the most striking things about emotional patterns is how they can determine who you attract into your life and who you are drawn to, not through any mystical mechanism, but through the basic psychology of familiarity. If you grew up in an environment where emotional unavailability was the norm, where you had to work for attention, where warmth was inconsistent, where you learned to equate longing with love, then emotional unavailability in another person will feel familiar to you. Not comfortable, necessarily, not preferable, but recognizable. And the nervous system, as we have discussed, tends to move toward what is recognizable. This is why people sometimes find themselves repeatedly drawn to the same type of person, even when that person is clearly not right for them. Not because they enjoy being hurt, not because they are masochistic, but because something in the dynamic resonates with a deep emotional familiarity, because it activates the same emotional pattern, and that pattern, however painful, is home territory. The same applies to the emotional reactions you have to situations. If you learned that disagreement leads to danger, you will experience disagreement as dangerous even when it is not. If you learned that success invites punishment or envy, you will feel a reflexive anxiety at the edge of success, even when there is no actual punishment coming. If you learned that needing people leads to disappointment, you will feel a preemptive guardedness in relationships, even with people who are genuinely available. The emotional pattern does not update automatically just because the circumstances have changed. It needs something more than new circumstances to change. It needs awareness and time and repeated experiences of something different. But before any of that can happen, there needs to be recognition. There needs to be the moment when you notice, perhaps for the first time or perhaps for the 100th time, but more clearly than before, this reaction I am having is not entirely about now. There is something old in this, something familiar, something that predates this moment and this person. That recognition is not comfortable. It requires a kind of honesty that can be disorienting, because it means acknowledging that the emotional truth you have been living, the one that feels so immediate and real, is partially a story that was written long before now, partially a script that is playing out because it is the only script the nervous system has ever learned. But this recognition is also, in a profound way, freeing. Because if the pattern was learned, it can be unlearned. Not instantly, not without difficulty, but genuinely, in a way that is not just behavioral but felt, in a way that eventually changes not just what you do, but how you feel. The emotional patterns are where so much of the repetition lives, not just in behavior, but in the inner life, in the quality of your experience, in the way the same emotional weather keeps returning, regardless of the external circumstances. To understand this is to begin to live differently inside your own life, not dramatically, not through some sudden transformation, but through a slowly growing capacity to watch your own emotional responses with curiosity rather than helplessness, to recognize the old material, to give it space without being entirely consumed by it, to choose, gradually and imperfectly, something slightly different. This is what it means to work with an emotional pattern, not to eliminate the feeling, but to change your relationship to it, to stop being run by it and begin, slowly, to respond to it. The emotional patterns are not the enemy. They are the record of everything you learned about how to survive your particular emotional history. The question now is whether those lessons are still the ones you need. Of all the forces that keep patterns in place, identity may be the most powerful, because patterns do not just exist as habits or emotional reactions. Over time, they become integrated into something deeper and harder to touch. They become part of the story you tell about who you are. And the story you tell about who you are may be the most influential force in your life. More influential, in many cases, than your actual circumstances. More influential than your opportunities. More influential than the advice you receive, the books you read, or the intentions you carry into the new year with full sincerity. The story you tell about who you are shapes what you allow, what you pursue, what you believe is possible, and what you discard before it even gets started. And much of that story was written, not by you, but for you. By the environment, the relationships, and the experiences of your early life. You inherited it, you absorbed it. And then, without realizing it, you made it yours. You made it you. The identity story is not a single narrative. It is more like a collection of deeply held beliefs about yourself, some of which you are aware of, and many of which you are not. Beliefs like, I am the kind of person who struggles with money. I am not someone who finishes things. I am not naturally confident. I am too sensitive. I am not good with people. I am someone who always ends up alone. I am someone who always messes things up just when they are going well. These beliefs may have begun as observations, patterns noticed in experience and interpreted as facts about the self. But once they became identity, they stopped being observations. They became operating instructions. And the mind, loyal to its own model of what you are, begins to act in accordance with those instructions. Not deliberately, not consciously, but consistently, reliably, and with extraordinary thoroughness. This is sometimes described in psychology as self-concept maintenance. The idea that the mind has a strong, largely unconscious drive to maintain a consistent sense of self, not necessarily a positive sense of self, but a consistent one. Consistency, to the brain, is a form of safety. A self that is stable and predictable is easier to navigate than one that is constantly shifting. Which means that if your stable, consistent self-concept includes the belief that you are someone who fails, the brain will, in subtle and not so subtle ways, work to confirm that belief, not because it wants you to fail, but because your failure confirms the model, and a confirmed model is a stable one. This is one of the more unsettling aspects of identity and repetition to sit with. The idea that the mind may actually resist outcomes that contradict its model of who you are, even positive ones. Think about a time when something good happened that felt somehow hard to absorb. A success that made you feel anxious rather than simply pleased. A relationship that was going well, but that you found yourself undermining, almost without knowing why. A compliment that you deflected or dismissed before it could fully land. If your self concept does not include someone who receives success comfortably. Success will feel wrong, not just uncomfortable, wrong, like something that does not belong in your life, something that will be corrected, and the mind will, often, work to correct it. This is part of what underlies what is sometimes called self-sabotage. The pattern of pulling away from good things, or creating problems just as things are going well, or making choices that seem irrational from the outside, but make perfect sense once you understand the identity structure beneath them. Self-sabotage is not stupidity. It is not weakness. It is the mind maintaining its model of who you are. And if that model says you are not someone who gets to have the good thing, not really, not lastingly, then the model will reassert itself whenever the good thing appears to be sticking around too long. This operates in relationships with particular power. The attachment patterns formed in early life, the models of how close relationships work, what to expect from people, how much to trust, how much to need, become a central part of self-concept. And they filter all subsequent relationships through the lens of that model. If your model includes, "I am someone who ends up abandoned," you will, often unconsciously, perceive threat in situations that do not necessarily contain it. You will interpret ambiguous messages through the lens of abandonment. You will feel the onset of abandonment before there is evidence for it. And you may behave in ways that, through a painful irony, actually increase the risk of the outcome you fear. This is not a self-fulfilling prophecy in the simple sense. It is more like a self-confirming filter. The model shapes what you notice, how you interpret it, and how you respond. And those responses create outcomes that feel like proof of the model. The loop closes, the pattern holds, and the identity story gets a little stronger. Now here is something important about identity and repetition. The repetition often feels like evidence. Every time the familiar outcome appears, it feels like confirmation that the identity story was right all along. See, you think, I really am someone who struggles with this. I really am someone who ends up in this situation. This is just who I am. But the evidence was shaped by the story. The story came first. The outcomes followed from the operating instructions the story provided. The evidence is real. The outcomes did happen, but they were not inevitable. They were the logical result of a set of beliefs that organized behavior in a particular direction. Which means that if the beliefs change, the outcomes can too. But beliefs are not easy to change. Especially beliefs that feel like facts. Especially beliefs that are held below the level of conscious awareness. Especially beliefs that are reinforced by years of experience that, when viewed through the right lens, all seems to point in the same direction. There is also a social dimension to identity that makes patterns particularly persistent. The people around you have, over time, developed their own model of who you are, and that model shapes how they treat you, what they expect from you, and how they interpret your behavior. When you try to change, you may find that the people in your life, without malice, often with love, continue to respond to you as the person you were rather than the person you are trying to become. This is not a conspiracy against your growth. It is simply how relationships work. People build models of each other, and those models update slowly. The person who has always played the helper role in a family finds that their attempts to express needs or set limits are met with confusion or resistance, not because their family does not love them, but because the new behavior does not fit the familiar model. The model pushes back. This social pressure to remain consistent with the expected self is one of the most underestimated forces in the psychology of change. You are not just fighting your own internal identity structure. You are, in a sense, navigating the identity structures that others have built for you. This does not mean change is impossible. It means change needs to be understood as a social process, not just an internal one. It means that genuine, lasting change may require creating new relational contexts, or at least honestly acknowledging the way existing ones are pulling on the old self. There is also something worth saying about the identity patterns that were explicitly instilled. The messages you were given, verbally or behaviorally, about what kind of person you were. The labels: good child, difficult one, the smart one, the pretty one, the troublemaker. The comparisons, the assessments of what you were capable of and what was beyond you. Many of those messages were not meant to harm. They were often meant to help, to protect, to prepare. But they landed in a child who took them literally, who absorbed them without the capacity to critically examine them, who made them part of the foundation of self-understanding. Some of those messages were accurate. Many were not. Some were projections of the fears or frustrated ambitions of the adults around you. Some were the result of your particular personality failing to match what those adults knew how to love or understand. Some were simply wrong, well-intentioned, perhaps, but factually incorrect assessments of who you were and who you could be. And yet you may still be living by them. Not because you decided to, but because the mind, as we have established, is extremely efficient at operating on established models. And if the model was built on certain early messages, the model will keep running until it is examined, challenged, and rebuilt. This is perhaps the most profound form of pattern repetition, not the repeated behavior, not even the repeated emotional response, but the repeated story. The story of who you are, running quietly beneath everything else, organizing your choices and your perceptions and your possibilities into the shape it has always known. To question that story is not to become someone else. It is to stop being run by a story that someone else wrote about you. It is to become the author of the next version. Not randomly, not wishfully, but through the slow, serious work of understanding what the current story is, where it came from, and what it has been costing you. The identity is not a cage. It is a habit. And habits, even the deepest ones, can be changed. There is a particular moment that most people who have worked with their patterns can describe. It is not dramatic. It does not come with a sense of revelation or transformation. It is quiet, almost anticlimactic, but it is everything. It is the moment when you catch yourself in the pattern, not after, not in hindsight, when you are reviewing what happened and recognizing again, with familiar frustration, that you did the thing you always do, but in the middle of it. While it is happening, while the pull of the old response is strong and the path of least resistance is entirely clear and every familiar signal is saying do what you always do, in that moment something shifts. Not dramatically. You may not even make a different choice. But for a fraction of a second, or a few seconds, or a few minutes, there is a gap. There is distance between you and the pattern. There is the pattern, and there is something observing the pattern, and those two things are not the same. That gap is the beginning of everything. Awareness is not the same as change. People sometimes confuse the two. They become aware of a pattern, and they expect, reasonably, hopefully, that the awareness itself will change things. And then they are discouraged when the pattern keeps repeating. When they find themselves, yet again, in the familiar situation, doing the familiar thing, despite knowing. But awareness is not supposed to immediately stop the pattern. Awareness is a different kind of thing. It is the beginning of a new relationship with the pattern. It is the opening of a space where something else might eventually become possible. Think of it this way. If you have been walking the same path through a forest for 20 years, the path is deep. The ground is worn. The way is clear. When you start walking through the forest, your feet find the path without being asked. You are on it before you have consciously decided to be on it. Awareness does not fill in the path. It does not make the path disappear. What it does is allow you to notice, at some point during your walk, that you are on the path again. And once you notice that you have a choice, however uncomfortable and unfamiliar, to step off it. The step off the path is the hard part. The noticing is the necessary first part. Without the noticing, there is no step. Without the awareness, The pattern runs completely unimpeded, and there is no possibility of doing anything other than what the pattern dictates. But once there is awareness, genuine, present, moment awareness, not just intellectual recognition, then possibility enters the space. What does awareness actually feel like in practice? Because awareness is often taught as if it were simply thinking about your patterns, as if reading about psychology or understanding your childhood or intellectually grasping why you do what you do was sufficient. It is not. Intellectual understanding is valuable, and this audiobook is built on it. But intellectual understanding alone does not interrupt the pattern in the moment. The pattern does not live primarily in the thinking brain. It lives in the body, in the nervous system, in the emotional reflexes. And to interrupt it, the awareness needs to reach there. This is why many people who understand their patterns very well still live them very fully. They can give you a precise and insightful account of why they do what they do. They know the childhood roots. They understand the attachment style. They can name the emotional pattern accurately. And then the familiar situation arises, and the familiar response fires, and they watch it happen with clear-eyed helplessness. Understanding is not the same as awareness in the body. Understanding is from the outside, looking in. Awareness in the body is from the inside in real time. What does this kind of awareness feel like? It is noticing the physical sensation of the pattern beginning, the tightening in the chest before the defensive response, the sudden withdrawal of energy before the shutdown, the familiar pull toward a familiar relief that you know, somewhere, will cost you, the texture of the impulse before you act on it. It is being present enough to feel the precursors to the pattern, the early signals, the first notes of the familiar song. This takes practice, not because it is inherently difficult, but because the habits of inattention are as strong as the patterns themselves. Most of life is lived with divided attention, some of you in the present moment, and the rest scattered across past conversations and future anxieties, and the background noise of an overstimulated mind. Genuine presence, the kind of grounded, embodied attention that actually notices what is happening inside you in real time, requires deliberate cultivation. But it is possible, and the good news is that you do not have to achieve perfect mindfulness for awareness to begin to interrupt your patterns. You do not need to be a meditation master. You need only to practice coming back to the present moment often enough that you occasionally arrive there before the pattern has already run its full course. The more often you arrive in time to notice, the more often you have the opportunity to respond rather than react. Not always, not perfectly, but with increasing frequency. There is something important to say about the quality of awareness that is most useful. The awareness that interrupts patterns is not judgmental. It is not the inner voice that says, "I am doing it again. I am so hopeless. Why can I never get this right?" That voice is not awareness. That voice is another pattern, a self-critical response that was also learned, and that tends to make the original pattern worse, not better. The awareness that interrupts is neutral, curious, almost clinical in its detachment, but not cold, more like the attention of someone who is genuinely interested in what they are observing without being caught up in it. There is the pattern. There it is. I am in it right now. I can feel where it is going. That quality of observation, clear, unjudging present, does something remarkable to a pattern. It does not stop it, necessarily, but it changes the relationship to it. You are no longer inside the pattern, being carried by it. You are alongside it. You can see its shape. You can feel where it is going. You can, if you choose, step slightly to the side. That stepping slightly to the side is not the same as transformation. It is something humbler and more real. It is a small choice, made in a real moment, to do something slightly different. Maybe to pause before responding. Maybe to name what you are feeling rather than acting on it. Maybe to ask yourself, in the heat of the familiar moment, is this the pattern, or is this actually what I choose? Even asking the question is different from not asking it. Even pausing for 3 seconds before the automatic response is different from not pausing. These small things accumulate, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. Every time awareness interrupts a pattern, even briefly, the pattern loses a small fraction of its hold. The automatic retrieval slows down just slightly. The gap widens just marginally, and over time, not weeks usually, often months, sometimes years, but genuinely over time, the gap becomes large enough to live in. The awareness comes earlier in the process. The old response feels less inevitable. The new response, practiced incrementally, begins to develop its own kind of familiarity. This is how change through awareness actually works. Not as a switch that gets flipped, but as a gradual and uneven process of building a new relationship with the patterns that have run your life. There is also something worth saying about awareness and compassion. The awareness that is most useful toward yourself is not harsh, not in the spirit of finally catching yourself in the act, or finally seeing how damaged you are, or finally understanding what is wrong with you. The awareness that heals is the awareness that can see clearly and remain kind, that can observe the pattern without condemning the person who carries it, that can say, with genuine gentleness, I understand why this pattern exists. I see what it was built to protect. I do not need to hate it to change it. This may feel counterintuitive, particularly if you were raised in an environment where self-criticism was equated with self-improvement, where being hard on yourself was seen as the responsible position, where compassion for your own struggles was confused with making excuses. But the evidence is consistent and clear. Self-criticism entrenches patterns. It activates the threat response, which makes the familiar response more likely, not less. It creates shame, and shame reliably drives people deeper into the behaviors they are ashamed of. Self-compassion, the real kind, not the self-indulgent kind, creates the psychological safety necessary to look clearly at difficult things, to sit with awareness of your patterns without having to defend against the awareness, to see clearly without the seeing becoming unbearable. You cannot change what you cannot bear to look at, and what you cannot bear to look at stays hidden, and what stays hidden stays automatic, and what is automatic continues to shape your life without your consent. The aware, compassionate observer is the most powerful agent of change available to you, not the inner critic, not the ashamed avoider, the clear kind, witnessing self that can look at the pattern and say, I see you, I understand you, I am not afraid of you, and I am ready, slowly and imperfectly, to try something different. That readiness is where the work of change begins. By now, you may be thinking, if I understand the pattern, if I can see it clearly, if I approach it with awareness and compassion, then why is change still so hard? This is not a small question. It is one that deserves a full answer, because many people get here. They understand their patterns, they see them clearly, they even feel genuinely ready to be different, and then they hit a wall. The change they expected to feel liberating instead feels wrong. Instead of feeling like progress, it feels like loss. Instead of opening up, it closes down. This experience is not a sign that you have failed. It is not evidence that you are too broken to change, or that the insights you have gained were illusory. It is simply the predictable, inevitable reality of what it feels like to move away from the familiar. The unfamiliar feels wrong. That is the single most important thing to understand about the discomfort of change. Not wrong as in morally wrong. Wrong as in, this does not fit my existing model. This is not the shape of things as I know them. This is not how my life feels. And the nervous system, loyal to its model, flags it as incorrect. You need to understand this feeling, because if you do not, you will interpret it as a signal that you are making a mistake, that the new behavior is bad, that the insight was wrong, that you should go back. And the pattern, patient and familiar, will be right there waiting. Think about what happens when you try to change a deeply established pattern, when the person who has always been self Sufficient tries to ask for help. When the person who has always said yes tries to say no. When the person who has always gone quiet tries to speak. When the person who has always stayed tries to leave. In the moment of doing the new thing, there is often a flood of discomfort, a sense of exposure, of wrongness, of having transgressed something fundamental. The body tenses. The inner voice offers objections. A part of you braces for consequences that, at a rational level, you know are not coming, but that at a deeper level feel inevitable. This is the nervous system responding to unfamiliarity. It is not wisdom. It is not intuition. It is pattern protection. The system that has been running your familiar responses is reacting to a threat. Not a physical threat, but a threat to the established order of your internal world. And here is the painful irony. The more significant the pattern you are trying to change, the stronger this discomfort will be. The most important changes, the ones that would genuinely alter the shape of your life, are precisely the ones that activate the most resistance, because they threaten the most foundational layers of the familiar. This is why people often make partial changes and then stop. They get close enough to feel the discomfort and interpret it as a signal to retreat. They do not retreat because they are cowards or because they lack willpower. They retreat because the discomfort is real and it speaks with authority and it sounds very much like the truth. But it is not the truth about what is right for you. It is the truth about what is familiar to you. And those are not the same thing. There is also the matter of grief. This is something that is rarely talked about in discussions of personal change, but it deserves to be. When you genuinely change a deep pattern, you lose something. Even if what you lose was not serving you, even if letting it go is unambiguously the right thing to do, there is a loss. The person who finally allows themselves to stop waiting for a parent's approval that will never come grieves the dream of that approval. The person who ends a relationship defined by familiar drama grieves the particular intimacy that drama created, however painful. The person who stops playing small grieves the safety of invisibility. These are real losses. They are not logical. They are not something you can think your way out of. They need to be felt. And if they are not acknowledged, if you try to move through change as if it were only gain, only progress, only positive, the unacknowledged grief tends to pull you back, to make the old pattern feel like relief rather than retreat, allowing yourself to grieve what the pattern provided. Even the painful patterns, which always provided something, usually a form of protection or familiarity or predictability, is part of the work of change. It is not weakness. It is the full, dimensional emotional honesty that real change requires. There is another dimension to the discomfort of change that is worth examining carefully, the relational one. When you change, you do not change in a vacuum. You change in the context of relationships, and relationships are systems. When you alter your behavior in a system, the system responds. Sometimes that response is supportive and warm. But often, at least initially, it is destabilizing. The people who were adapted to your old patterns may not know how to respond to your new ones. The person who was used to having unlimited access to your emotional labor may feel confused or even hurt when you begin to establish limits. The person who relied on your conflict avoidance to keep the peace may feel threatened when you begin to speak directly. The dynamic shifts, and shifts can feel like damage. This does not mean your change is wrong. It does not mean you should stop, but it does mean that you should anticipate some turbulence in your relationships as you shift. Some of that turbulence will settle. The people who genuinely love you will adapt, over time, to the person you are becoming. But some relationships may not survive the change, not because the change was wrong, but because those relationships were built around a version of you that no longer exists. This is also a form of loss that deserves to be named. Not minimized, but not dramatized, but honestly acknowledged. One final thing about the discomfort of change. There is a particular kind of discomfort that comes from doing the new thing and finding that it does not immediately feel better. You spoke up when you normally would have stayed quiet, and it was awkward and messy. You set the limit, and there was conflict. You tried the new approach, and it did not go smoothly. This moment, the imperfect execution of a new behavior, is one of the highest risk moments for returning to the old pattern, because the discomfort of the unfamiliar is still present, and now there is also the discomfort of having done something new and having it not work perfectly. The inner voice says, "See, the old way was better. At least you knew what you were doing." But the new behavior was not supposed to be smooth. You are learning it. You are practicing it for the first time. Of course, it is awkward. Of course, it does not have the fluency of something you have done 10,000 times. Awkwardness is not failure. It is learning. And every awkward, imperfect attempt at a new behavior is more valuable than 1,000 perfect executions of the old one. Because the imperfect new attempt is building something. The old behavior is just confirming what already exists. The discomfort of change is real. It should be respected. It should not be minimized or dismissed with cheerful reassurances that growth is supposed to feel good. Growth often does not feel good. It often feels strange and unsteady and quietly terrifying. But on the other side of the discomfort is something the familiar can never provide. Not comfort in the old sense. Not the warm recognition of familiar ground. Something different, the growing sense of being in your own life deliberately. Of having some authorship over what is being built. Of the future being just slightly more than before your own. That is not a small thing, even when it does not feel like much, even when it is slow and imperfect and harder than you thought. It is worth the discomfort. If the old patterns were built through repetition, then new patterns are also built through repetition. This is not a complicated idea, but it has profound implications for how you approach change, because it means that change is not primarily an event, not a decision, not an insight, not a moment of clarity, though all of these may be the beginning. Change is a practice. It is something you do, imperfectly and repeatedly, until the doing of it begins to feel more natural than the not doing of it. The new pattern needs to be practiced the same way the old one was. Frequently enough, consistently enough, that the neural pathway begins to form and deepen, that the nervous system starts to recognize it as familiar, that the body begins to know, through experience rather than through intention, what this new way feels like. This takes longer than you want it to, significantly longer. The research on habit formation suggests that new behaviors take anywhere from 2 to 8 months to become genuinely automatic, depending on the complexity of the behavior and the consistency of the practice, and the patterns we are discussing here. Emotional patterns, relational patterns, deeply held behavioral tendencies are more complex than most habits. They will take time, real time. This does not mean the journey is not worth taking. It means the journey requires patience. It requires a different relationship with progress, one that does not expect linear improvement and is not discouraged by setbacks, one that can recognize that the process itself is the progress. So what does building new patterns deliberately actually look like? It begins with specificity, not the general intention to be different, but the specific identification of what, concretely, you want to do differently in a particular kind of situation. The general intention. I want to stop being so anxious. I want to be better in relationships. I want to stop self-sabotaging, is valuable as a direction, but it is too broad to practice. You cannot practice being less anxious in the abstract. You can practice when you notice the physical sensation of anxiety beginning, taking 3 slow breaths before responding to whatever is happening. You can practice naming the emotion to yourself. I am feeling anxious right now. That is a specific, practicable action. The specificity matters because the new pattern needs to be laid down in real situations, in real moments. Not as a general orientation, but as a specific response in a specific context. The more clearly you can define the context and the response, the more efficiently the practice will build the new pathway. This also means identifying the trigger, not with the goal of eliminating the trigger. That is rarely possible, but with the goal of inserting something new between the trigger and the usual response. A pause, a breath, a moment of noticing, even a few seconds of conscious attention between stimulus and response can, over time, widen into something more substantial. The pause is one of the most powerful tools in the deliberate building of new patterns, not because the pause itself is a solution, but because the pause creates the gap in which choice lives. The automatic response requires no gap. It fires and the gap is closed before it opened. But if you can build the habit of pausing, even briefly, even imperfectly, you begin to live slightly more in the space of choice and slightly less in the space of pure reaction. Building new patterns also requires tolerance for imperfection, not just intellectual tolerance, not just saying I know it is going to be messy, but genuine emotional tolerance. The ability to do the new thing badly and not to use the badness as a reason to return to the old thing. This is harder than it sounds. The old pattern is fluent. It is executed with the smoothness of long practice. The new pattern is clumsy. It has the awkward quality of something being learned, and in the moment of comparison, the old pattern can feel superior simply on the basis of its fluency. But fluency is not the same as rightness. The old pattern is fluent because it has been practiced 10,000 times. The new one is clumsy because it is in its early stages. Fluency will come, but only through continued practice, and the continued practice requires the emotional permission to be clumsy in the meantime. There is something worth saying about the role of environment in building new patterns. Your physical and social environment shapes your behavior more powerfully than you might realize. If the old pattern is strongly associated with certain environments, certain people, certain contexts, and it usually is, then changing the environment can make the practice of the new pattern significantly easier. This does not mean you need to relocate your life. It means paying attention to the conditions under which the old pattern runs most readily and asking whether any of those conditions can be modified. The person who eats unconsciously while watching television might practice eating at the table without a screen, not as a permanent rule, but as a way of interrupting the automatic association long enough for a different pattern to begin forming. The person whose most destructive relationship pattern is triggered by loneliness might practice identifying the onset of loneliness and choosing a specific, concrete response to it before the old pattern fires. These small environmental modifications are not dramatic, but they are effective. They change the context enough to disrupt the automatic retrieval, creating more space for the new pattern to be practiced. The people around you also matter, in a way that is both obvious and often overlooked. Being in the presence of people who embody the patterns you are trying to build, not in a worshipful or comparative way, but in the simple sense of normalization, can make those patterns feel more possible. The nervous system learns not just through direct experience, but through observation. Spending time with people whose behavior models what you are trying to practice is itself a form of practice. There is also the question of how you talk to yourself about the process. The inner narrative around your attempts at change matters more than most people realize. The narrative that frames setbacks as evidence of failure creates shame and discouragement. The narrative that frames them as information, as data about where the practice needs to be deepened or refined, creates resilience. The narrative that says I am always going to be this way is not just emotionally damaging, it is neurologically self-fulfilling. The narrative that says I am in the process of building something different is not blind optimism, it is accurate description. The language of process, I am practicing, I am building, I am learning, is more useful than the language of state. I am anxious, I am broken, I am stuck. State language implies permanence. Process language implies movement, and movement, however slow and uneven, is what you are actually in. There is one more thing to say about building new patterns deliberately, and it may be the most important. The new patterns need to be rooted in values, not just in the desire to be different. Because the desire to be different is not always stable. It peaks in moments of clarity and fades in moments of tiredness or stress. It is easy to want to be different when you are feeling reflective and calm. It is much harder when you are in the middle of a difficult situation and every familiar signal is pointing toward the old response. What sustains the practice through those difficult moments is not the abstract desire to change. It is the connection to what actually matters to you, the clarity about what kind of person you want to be, what kind of relationships you want to have, what kind of life you want to build. Not as a fantasy, but as a genuine value, something that means enough to you to practice toward, even when the practice is uncomfortable. When the practice is grounded in values, it has an anchor that the desire to change does not. Values do not fade in the same way. They can be accessed in the difficult moments, not just the clear ones. They can remind you, in the midst of the familiar pull of the old pattern, why you are doing this. Why the new way matters. Why the discomfort is worth it. What do you value genuinely? Not what you think you should value or what sounds admirable, but what actually matters to you in a felt, lived sense. Connection, honesty, integrity, presence, growth, the capacity to love freely, the capacity to be yourself without apology. Build the new patterns toward those, not because they are ideals, but because they are yours. Because when you act in alignment with them, something in you recognizes the rightness of it, not the familiarity, but the rightness. And that recognition, repeated often enough, becomes its own kind of compass. The new pattern is built through repetition, like the old one. But unlike the old one, it is built deliberately, consciously, in the direction of what you have chosen rather than what you inherited. That distinction makes all the difference. You have been on a long journey through this audiobook. Not just through the content, but through something more personal than content. Through a kind of honest looking at the patterns in your life, at where they came from, at what they have cost you, and at what might be possible if they began to change. That kind of looking is not comfortable, but it is rare, and it is necessary. Most people move through their lives without ever pausing long enough to see the patterns clearly, without ever asking, with genuine curiosity rather than self-blame, why do I keep doing this? What is this actually about? What is it serving? You asked those questions. You followed them here. And that matters more than you might realize, because the recognition, the real, honest recognition, is not a small thing. It is, in many ways, the hardest thing, harder than the change itself in some ways, because change can be approached gradually, incrementally, with patience and imperfection. But the recognition requires a kind of courage that does not get practiced enough. The courage to look clearly at yourself without either defending what you see or collapsing under the weight of it. You did that, and you can do it again. Every time you do, the awareness deepens. Every time you come back to the question with genuine curiosity, the patterns become a little more visible, a little less invisible, a little less running the show undetected. There are a few things worth holding as you move forward from this audiobook. The first is this: the patterns you carry are not evidence of your failure. They are evidence of your history. They are the logical outcome of a mind doing exactly what minds do, learning from experience, encoding what it learned, repeating what it encoded. You did not choose those patterns any more than you chose the language you think in. You absorbed them, you adapted around them, and they became the architecture of your life. You are not broken because of them. You are simply human, fully, normally, recognizably human. The second thing worth holding is that understanding is not the same as changing, and changing is not the same as being changed. Understanding is the beginning. Awareness is the practice. Change is the long, nonlinear, imperfect process of doing something different often enough that it begins to feel possible, and then normal, and then natural. None of that happens all at once. None of it happens in a straight line. There will be weeks or months when the old patterns seem as strong as they ever were, and the progress you thought you had made feels like an illusion. This is part of the process. This is not failure. It is the normal rhythm of real change, which moves in cycles, not in straight lines, which visits the old territory again and again, each time with slightly different eyes, each time with slightly more awareness, each time leaving just a little sooner than the last. The third thing worth holding is that you are not doing this alone, even when it feels that way. Every person who has ever seriously engaged with their patterns, who has looked honestly at the repetitions in their life and asked why, and sat with the discomfort of that question rather than running from it, is part of the same human endeavor. The same ancient effort to understand the self, to be more conscious than the programming, to choose more often than before who you want to be rather than defaulting to who you have been. You are in that company. Even in your most private, most interior moments of self-examination, you are part of something much larger than your individual history. And the fourth thing, perhaps the most important, is simply this: the pattern is not your identity. Read that again and let it land. The pattern is not your identity. The pattern is something that has been repeated so many times, in so many contexts, that it began to feel like you, began to feel like the shape of your character, the nature of your personality, the truth of who you are. But it is not. It never was. It is a pathway in the nervous system, a learned response, a story that was absorbed before you were old enough to question it, practiced before you were aware you were practicing, and carried forward into a life that might look very different if the pathway were different. The pathway can be different, not immediately, not without effort and discomfort and the patient, imperfect repetition of something new, but genuinely, really, in ways that will eventually be felt in the texture of your daily life. You do not repeat patterns because you want to suffer. You never did. You repeat them because the mind returns to what is familiar, because familiarity, to the deeper parts of your brain, is a form of safety, because change requires moving into uncertain territory, and uncertain territory triggers an ancient alarm that says, stop, turn back, go home. But home, as you have learned, does not always mean the healthiest place. Sometimes it just means the most practiced one. You are building a new home, slowly, one new response at a time, one moment of awareness at a time, one pause, one breath, one choice that was slightly different from the automatic one. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. The path you have been walking through this audiobook ends here. But the walking does not. The awareness you have built is not something that belongs to this hour or this session. It belongs to your life now, to the ordinary days ahead, the conversations, the decisions, the emotional moments, the familiar pulls and the new possibilities. Carry the awareness there. Carry it not as a burden, not as a measuring stick against which you will perpetually fall short, but as a companion, a quiet, curious, compassionate presence within you that can look at what is happening and say, I see this. I understand this. I am not afraid of this. And when the pattern comes, and it will come, meet it not with shame and not with surrender. Meet it with recognition, with the simple, clear, honest seeing that says, there it is again, the old familiar shape, and then ask yourself gently, is this what I choose? Or is this simply what I have always done? That question, asked often enough, with enough honesty and enough patience and enough compassion for yourself, changes everything. Not overnight, not perfectly, but genuinely, in the slow, real, enduring way that actual change always works. The pattern is not your identity. It is simply what has been repeated, and what is repeated can also be changed.